Do you like fighters or spacecraft design? Grab your copy of the first Spacedock reference book all about these topics on our Patreon through the link in the description and pinned comment below. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Joanna, and recently I've been save-scumming my merry way through XCOM 2, and the great variety of enemies in the game got me thinking about multi-species factions in general across sci-fi. On the face of it, they don't seem to show up that much, with factions instead tending towards being split up along species lines. Mass Effect demonstrates this really well, as while yes there is the Council, that is much more along the lines of the UN, just something that each nation-state contributes to forward everyone's individual goals. The Asari, Solarians, humans, etc. are all still separate nations with their own territory and governments. They just work together sometimes because it's impractical not to. It is pretty fair that things tend to be set up this way in sci-fi, as there is a wide variety of physical requirements that each species has that need to be met for survival. One type of atmosphere that works great for one species may be poisonous to others, or their food is entirely incompatible, or they have entirely different sensory systems or methods of communication. In the world of filming and technical requirements, this doesn't always apply though. Instead, it's very common to just hand-wave these problems away, and the aliens featured in any particular setting just end up being super compatible with each other and humanity, with maybe one or two species that need special consideration for variety's sake. But if it was taken more into account, then these differences would make it pretty unlikely for two or more different species like that to end up working together so closely that they essentially become a single nation state. In the case of the aliens in XCOM, the antagonistic faction is made up of a number of species that have been heavily genetically modified by the Elders, the shadowy leaders behind the invasion of Earth. Here the faction is multi-species, but it doesn't seem to be on a voluntary basis, given the military and psionic power of the aliens and their high usage of genetic modification. Instead, the Elders used their resources to take over other species in their search for a cure to their bodies failing, amalgamating new species into their armies on the way. And they do this very aggressively, modifying and updating their forces to better fit whatever role is required, and even creating new hybrid beings to serve them. Another very similar antagonistic faction that did this is Half-Life's Combine. They too have a leader species that controls everyone else in the form of the Overseers, and their forces are also made up of the subjugated peoples and creatures from worlds and dimensions they have invaded. The difference here is that their modifications go a step further and integrate technology and biomechanics into their new servants, better suiting the differing tones between the camper, cheesier XCOM and the more serious route that Half-Life 2 takes. Both inflict horrible changes on humanity and others, but what the Combine do is far more visceral. Yet another video game faction that does this for the sake of gameplay variety is of course Halo's Covenant, though this time the highest echelons of their society are at least a little more interesting. Yes, their civilization is a caste-based one, but the top two species that share power have a bit more of a balanced relationship, with the prophets holding political and religious power and the elites holding military power. This proved to be a very stable relationship, and it was only after the Prophet of Truth broke this ancient pact that the entire Covenant began to collapse. Multi-species factions can happen without being quite so nasty though, as the Protheans kind of demonstrate in Mass Effect. Instead, they just subjugated different species and then kind of let them be as long as they served the Prothean Empire, which then also considered them to be Prothean just as anyone else was. So are all multi-species factions doomed to be varying levels of authoritarianism, only made up of conquered species made to serve? Well, no, as there's always Star Trek's Federation and the Orville's Union to hold up as fantastic examples of this happening voluntarily. However, they didn't really go as far as they could, and both don't go much beyond the Space UN that I mentioned earlier. Humans still have a very high presence in both, making up the apparent bulk of ships' crews and such, and each member species still has their own planets and colonies. But they do all work together way more than what occurs in Mass Effect. Pretty much the only Systems Alliance vessel with non-human crew is the Normandy, and that is because of some very special circumstances. In Starfleet though, it's a matter of course that any vessel can have all sorts of species living and working aboard it, even from outside of the Federation member planets. And their presence is celebrated too. Worf being a Klingon was rarely a point of contention, and he was always allowed to practice his cultural rituals and such, despite the Klingons not being part of the Federation. However, Star Trek has two very big antagonistic counterparts to the Federation that are both also multi-species, but in different ways: the Borg and the Dominion. In the case of the former, the collective was in massive contrast to the Federation, as while yes, it is made up of many thousands of different species, it always forced one blueprint upon everyone. There is no diversity amongst the Borg. Every drone is made to conform with the whole and loses their individuality. There is something to be said here for Quark's particular views on root beer and the implications of how the Federation spreads its ideals and takes over new members, but I don't see it. On a shallow level, Deep Space Nine staff are all jacked up on Ractagino 90% of the time, and that's Klingon. On a deeper level, it's not like the Federation members have lost their own cultural identity. They are just pretty good at spreading their values in a more slow and controlled manner. And Quark's comments come at a time when the Dominion was making great strides beyond the wormhole and outside of the Gamma Quadrant, and they are another multi-species faction that is split into distinct tiers. There is one species who rules the others, the Changelings, and the other member races pay tribute or act as their military. And we see how they treated the Cardassians after they joined, basically throwing them away as fodder, and eventually outright ordering genocide. There is a vast gulf here between the supposed insidiousness of the Federation and the sheer brutality of the Dominion. There would be little chance within the Dominion for the distinctiveness that the Vulcans retain despite being a Federation founding member. That brings me to yet another example found in Star Trek, the eventual reunion of the two sides of one coin, the joining of Romulan and Vulcan peoples into one, and the renaming of Vulcan to Nevar. This was put into motion by Spock during TNG, but took many centuries until the two groups reunified. But does this really count? I suppose that while they were both from Vulcan, the time apart did lead to significant cultural differences, but is it really a multi-species faction? A similar thing could be said for what happened in the reimagined Battlestar Galactica, as some of the Cylons and humans end up joining together and starting something new. But the non-robotic Cylons were made by older Cylons that come from a previous incarnation of the story, with everything being cyclical. So are they really multi-species? I think in this case it sort of is, as the Cylons have just enough differences to humanity both physically and culturally. Or do they, and is that the point? Going right back to XCOM, after the Elders and their puppet governments were defeated, there was still a whole bunch of aliens left on Earth without leadership. XCOM Chimera Squad shows that many of these peacefully integrated right into the society they were previously oppressing. The game itself puts you in control of a new peacekeeping agency under XCOM, but they have many members who are aliens too, thus the Chimera Squad moniker. Amusingly, one of those squad members is a Viper who considers herself to be an Earthling simply because that's where she's from, which is a fairly good point if you think about it. So multi-species factions do happen, but weirdly the most common depiction of them is one of subjugation, with one leader species who conquered and controls the others. There are sometimes depictions that are a little less horrible, but these end up being more on the side of separate entities working together, rather than full integration with one another. What is more common is little microcosms of this concept. Deep Space Nine, the Normandy, Babylon 5, all show many peoples from across the galaxy going about their daily lives together. This is what I want to see more of, just on a larger scale. I just think it's a fantastic method of reflection and examination of the human condition, and that is what science fiction is best at. Thanks for watching this video on multi-species factions. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and if you really enjoyed it, you can support the channel here on YouTube by giving us super thanks or by becoming a channel member. You can also join our Patreon and get a hold of our Space Fighter design reference book. Thanks to our supporters, and I'll see you next time.